The Chicago Bears are transitioning their defense this offseason, not only to a new scheme, but also in age. As they get younger, though, it seems like the level of talent is going down, too.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm an analyst for Pro Football Focus, and I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today, and hopefully every day. On the show today, we look at some of the defensive turnover, the defensive transition, starting with the newest addition, signed yesterday in free agency, safety Dane Cruikshank from the Tennessee Titans, another younger addition, and now coming into a safety group that has been thin with Deon Bush departed, and we'll kind of get into where he fits in that safety equation, if that's it, or if there could still be another player coming into a competition or to start there, or if Cruikshank will fit into that mold. We'll check in on this Bears defensive line, and Matt Eberflus leaving the door open for Larry Ogunjobi to potentially still come here, like we sort of hinted at, speculated earlier on this podcast when Ogunjobi failed his physical. We'll kind of look at what this defensive line looks like and how he could fit into that, and also the Bears' philosophy on the defensive line, a new acronym we got from Matt Eberflus. And we'll wrap up with the linebacker position as it stands right now with Roquan Smith and Nicholas Morrow, but clearly a need there to add at least one more player. But the new coaching staff, not positive which of the linebacker spots each of the two current guys will play in, and also sort of downplaying some of the need, acknowledging the need, but downplaying some of the need for that third linebacker based on how this defense is going to play this season. But the one that we do know that is in the building, the latest underwhelming free agent signing, is Dane Cruikshank from the Tennessee Titans. He's been kind of a backup for them. He was a fifth-round pick in 2018, has played special teams mostly through his first through his first 4 seasons, all 4 of them. And then this past season, he had a couple of opportunities to start earlier in the year due to injuries or whatever it was for the Titans. He started 4 games, and those were his only 4 career NFL starts. Otherwise, it's been special teams. He was kind of like their Deon Bush of sorts. Maybe they're DeAndre Houston Carson, but I think Deon Bush is probably the better analogy for them. And so as the Bears allow Deon Bush to sign elsewhere, they sign Dane Cruikshank. And right away, the question is he signed in here with the intention of giving him the chance to start? Or is he just here as purely the Deon Bush replacement, and then the team would then still potentially pursue another starting safety? Because we did see last season, DeAndre Houston Carson had some opportunities to start when the Bears had injuries and other issues at safety, and he played particularly well. Was it so well that you go into this season handing him the starting job? Probably not. But Dane Cruikshank also started some games last season for the Titans. And was it so good that you go into this season and hand Dane Cruikshank the job? No. But you have 2 players that have started games last season and had moments. I certainly think DeAndre Houston Carson looked better than what I know about Dane Cruikshank, which isn't, I don't cover the Tennessee Titans the way, I cover the Chicago Bears, but I've seen some of what Dane Cruikshank can do, and, there's a reason he's signing here on a 1-year deal worth a little over $1 million or a couple $1 million, right? He's not a high-priced free agent, and he's not a top-tier talent by any means, but he does have good special teams experience and, of course, has been a starter. So I could see perhaps the idea of saying between Houston, Carson, and Cruikshank, have a competition, and maybe one of them could produce a starting caliber safety. I also feel like I'd like to set the bar higher. And for me, it kind of comes down to a lot of what we saw last season with the Bears secondary at cornerback, where they said, okay, we'll have Vildor and Artie Burns and Duke Shelley compete, and maybe one of them will become a starting caliber cornerback. And out of those three, none of them did. And for me, it's kind of the same thing they talk about with quarterbacks when they say when you have two quarterbacks, you have none. I don't think that's universally true for every position, but it feels a little bit that way with the state of this safety position. And currently, with only three of them under contract, they're going to have to sign one anyway, with whether they're signing a veteran to step in clearly as the starter or potentially another backup. But Cruikshank fits this mold, right, of the other free agents the Bears have signed. When you think about Lucas Patrick and Equinemius St. Brown and Byron Pringle, younger players. Cruikshank is 26, about to turn 27 next month. Younger players who have had some flashes of bigger opportunities on other teams, but then can come to Chicago and potentially, depending on what they do at safety, have the opportunity bigger here to step into a greater role, but be very cheap in the process and be that low risk with the potential for high reward as a free agent signing. I still think, given some of the other free agent options that remain out there, at least at the time I'm recording this, you think like Tyrann Mathieu is still out there, Landon Collins, of course, Tashawn Gibson from the Bears last season, still available to be re-signed in that equation. It's a little bit too early to say, well, this is it. They don't have anybody else to bring in, especially because they have had some propensity to pursue some veterans. The Bears were reportedly one of the teams that pursued cornerback Patrick Peterson before he re-signed with the Minnesota Vikings yesterday. And so he's not a young player. He doesn't fit that mold of the other guys of sort of prove it here on cheap deal type contracts. Peterson also ended up cheap, but just not the same stage of his career as a lot of the other players the Bears have signed. And it goes to show that not every player they signed is going to fit that mold. They just happen to have so far, and there's still other veteran options that could be more the true starters, and Cruikshank could fit more in that Deion Bush role. I think that's perhaps the more ideal outcome, but there is the potential of starter upside between him and DeAndre Houston Carson. Let's just hope they can kind of take it a step further. We could see the Chicago Bears take it a step further on this defensive line, potentially adding another defensive tackle, a familiar face sort of, with potentially still bringing back Larry Ogunjobi, even though the deal fell apart with the failed physical, but leaving the door open for later in this offseason. We'll check in on where the defensive line depth sits right now and where Ogunjobi might still fit into that and how that group sort of fits into the rest of this defensive transition we're seeing next on Locked On Bears. We're getting down to just, the final four teams in the March college basketball tournament. And these games are going to be so much fun. You can make them even more fun by laying a little bit of money down with our friends at BetOnline. The national championship is coming up this week, and BetOnline.net is your number one source for all of your sports betting needs and information. From all the latest odds, contests, and player props, you name it, they have it at BetOnline. It's the best spot for all of your latest sports developments, including podcasts and reviews for all leagues all season. Because it's not just college basketball tournament. It's NFL draft prop bets, baseball season right around the corner, basketball approaching the playoffs, hockey approaching the playoffs, plus tennis, soccer, boxing, UFC, even live betting, and your favorite Vegas casino games, all online with our friends at betonline.net. Head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about all the trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. We heard all offseason that this Chicago Bears defense was going to start in the middle with, particularly the defensive tackle spots is what the defensive coordinator and the head coach, I guess, have both said at different stages throughout this offseason. It's why they made Larry Ogunjobi that first priority free agent signing, who of course then ultimately fell through, but they were still willing to pay him $13 million a year to make him, sort of the piece in the middle of this Bears defense. And fails the physical, has the injury, and that kind of goes out the door. But it hasn't gone completely out the door. You remember when the Bears announced the failed physical? We talked about it on this podcast. The quote from Ryan Poles at the time. Of course, he was saying all the right things, all the nice things about how, it was really difficult. They wanted him to be a part of the team. He was the guy they really envisioned in the middle of their defense. And he said something about, unfortunately, due to the circumstances or whatever, we will not be signing Larry Ogunjobi today. The last word there was today, was in his quote. And that was, at the time when we talked about it in the podcast, we were like, today? Now, he didn't say, we will not be signing Larry Ogunjobi, period. It was, we will not be signing Larry Ogunjobi today. And so when Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus met with the media now this past week down in Florida at the NFL owners meetings, Ryan Poles said that he's open to potentially still trying to sign Larry Ogunjobi down the line on what would obviously be then a lesser contract. But he said they haven't really had the conversations about that yet. The exact quote was, we haven't crossed that bridge yet, but it's a conversation I would like to have. So a lot of that's going to depend on, of course, the injury and what Ogunjobi is interested in doing, whether he still wants to come to the Chicago Bears, whether he would rather go somewhere else to maybe more, if he's going to sign another potentially short-term deal, right? That's what it would look like, I think, at this stage. He played a one-year deal last season with the Cincinnati Bengals, kind of a one-year prove-it type deal, did have his most productive season of his career, thought he was cashing in with the Chicago Bears on that $13 million a year contract. Now that he's filled the physical and is now not expected at this point to get a contract anywhere near that amount, because free agency has kind of run its course. Teams have made their decisions at that position. And even though he's still the same player, teams don't have as much salary cap space available. They don't have as much needs. It's sort of supply and demand here, right? He was the big supply, and now that he's not available, other teams filled their demand, and now there's less demand for him. And so then, of course, the price of his contract coming forward is not going to be significant. And so, therefore, if you're Larry Ogunjobi and you're saying, okay, crap, and it sucks for Larry Ogunjobi, and we feel bad for Larry Ogunjobi, but once you sort of assess the situation and say, you know what, okay, I'm not going to get a big payday now, why not just, I guess, sign another one-year prove-it deal somewhere, try to have another big season to hit free agency again next offseason, hopefully be healthier at that time, and then get, again, the big contract that he thought he was going to be getting from the Chicago Bears this year. And if I'm Larry Ogunjobi, trying to sign a one-year deal to play for a team that's going to help me make the most money next season, I don't know that the Chicago Bears fit that in the ways that we talk about this team building more long-term, right? Being patient in 2022 and understanding that this season might be a little bit rockier, but that they're trying to sort of develop and get the foundation in place for 2023 and beyond. And that doesn't seem like it's the best situation for Larry Ogunjobi to come in on a one-year prove-it type deal again and have the maximum production. It made sense, or I guess, I don't know, did it make sense a year ago for him to do that with the Bengals? I mean, no one last year necessarily fully thought the Bengals would be in the Super Bowl the following season, but it ended up working out. So, you never know, but I would think he may want to go to more of a situation with a true contending team and not exactly where the Chicago Bears are right now. If he would take a cheaper option here, whether it's a one-year deal or even a multi-year cheaper deal, I would absolutely be all for that. I mean, it'd be much better value to sign him at something significantly less than $13 million a year, because you are still getting the same player that you would have gotten had he passed his physical. Whether he passes the physical later or passed it the last time, you're presumably you're getting the same player for a lot less salary. And then you can add him in to this defensive line rotation and feel pretty good about some of the depth you have on the interior, in addition to then the depth that you have on the edge with, Robert Quinn still kind of leading that pack, Travis Gibson being the younger guy there. They signed Al-Qadim Muhammad. You still have Mario Edwards can play some of that spot. Jeremiah Atauchu is still on the roster as well, and he will probably play an edge rusher spot, even though he's a little bit undersized for that true 4-3 role. But then on the inside, with Justin Jones as the Larry Ogunjobi replacement, you could have Ogunjobi rotate in with him. You've got Kyrus Tonga and Angelo Blackson right now as sort of your primary nose tackle options there. You'd maybe like to add something there, but the NFL draft is still going to be potentially an opportunity to do so there. I'm just curious what the timeline might be for Ogunjobi. If his foot wasn't where the Bears expected it to be in March, does he wait until after the draft to sign? Is there going to be a team that goes to the draft, doesn't get a defensive tackle the way they wanted to, and then, brings in an Ogunjobi? Seems like every year, right, we have some of those veteran free agents that end up just sort of staying on the market, and it does tend to be the guys that are coming off of injuries. Like, I wonder if, Odell Beckham likely becomes one of these types of signings where he just waits a while and doesn't need to be under contract right now. It would be nice security, good job security, to say, yes, I've got the contract now, as opposed to, whatever could happen between now and when you actually sign that deal. But regardless, sometimes that patience can pay off for a team that for now says, no, we don't want to sign you because we want to see our other options. But once those other options dry up, Ogunjobi could end up being the best option for a couple of different teams, maybe. And then, not that he gets another $13 million a year contract, but could at least create a little bit more of a leverage bidding war type thing and not get, as little as potentially he would if he just signed with whoever might take him as soon as the foot is immediately healthy. I'm all for more depth on this Bears defensive line. They still have some other holes to keep filling on this defense, including still needing more linebackers and potentially a base defense starting linebacker, but they're not even sure yet exactly how they want to split Roquan Smith and Nicholas Morrow at each linebacker position and how that's all going to fit in the grand scheme of this Bears defense. We'll check in on the Mike position, the Will position, the Sam position, and how that fits with what Matt Eberflus will ask them to do next on Locked On Bears. Pardon. As the Bears transition from this 3-4 to this 4-3, of course, the responsibilities and positions of the linebackers end up changing the most, at least in terms of the base defense. But that's a very important caveat here, because the base defense is not going to be a frequent part of this Bears defense. And it's why we have to be careful when we talk about, that the transition from 4-3 to 3-4, because it can be easy to downplay it too much and to say it's zero big deal. And there is, there are going to be different things, Roquan Smith is being asked to do, or different ways he's asked to line up and read opposing offenses. And there are going to be differences in the way some of the defensive line techniques are taught and how they're asked to, one gap penetrate and different alignments based on the formation. But at the same time, Matt Eberflus continues to kind of, he's not intentionally downplaying it. He's not saying it's no big deal, but he is sort of finding ways to sort of remind us that it's not necessarily going to be a huge game changer for this Bears defense. It's just because that base 4-3 defense is just not going to be a huge part of everything they want to do defensively, right? They're very happy about the linebackers they had, and they had to, that they brought in, I should say, and they had to transition there with Danny Trevathan just being a little bit on the older side and injury-prone side and expensive side. And so that was a sort of a necessary evil, and they really like Nick Morrow. The quote from Matt Eberflus was, his resume is the tape. Worker, prepares, very smart. You can see the athleticism on tape, his ability to cover in space. He can cover a lot of ground, cover tight ends, cover running backs. So he's an exciting piece to add. And he kind of talked about the importance of having these guys on a 1-year prove-it contract like Nicholas Morrow. He said they have that chip on their shoulder that we're looking for. I think that's the first step to make sure that we get the locker room right, the culture right. And all of those guys are hungry to make plays. He kind of talked about how these type of players end up feeling like they deserved more, felt like they were out to gain respect for how they played, but also had an element of team to them. So you have in Roquan Smith and Nicholas Morrow two very athletic, fast linebackers, right? Speed is not going to be a problem with those guys. Maybe bulk and taking on blocks and shedding blocks is going to be a question in terms of run defense, but that's part of why, you've got two defensive tackles and two defensive ends, right? Part of why you have 4 down linemen instead of 3 down linemen, as of course, like the 4-3 and the 3-4. That's sort of the obvious of what those differences are there. But what's not clear yet is exactly which linebacker spots either of those two guys are going to set in, right? So you've got the middle linebacker, the weak side linebacker, and the strong side linebacker. And Matt Eberflus kind of said they're going to keep it open, right? He said, quote, "It's important to look at the skill set, and that's not to say one can't play the weak side position and then flip over to play the middle linebacker at times or vice versa." And so he said, so before I answer and start to move those guys in position, it's like, does Roquan play Will and Mike? We just need to take time to look at them on the grass. And you can kind of see the athletic ability of both would make them both more ideals on that weak side linebacker spot. You think about the back side that tends to not have the tight end to that side. You're thinking, they're the ones that are going to be a little bit more freed because there's not going to be as many blockers to their side, so they're not going to have to take on as many, not going to need as much physicality, but they're also going to have more space to cover, which again is why the speed is more important. Plus, teams generally tend to run toward, they tend to line up strong, and sometimes they will then cut back away from the strength, and sometimes you're going to need that speed to sort of get to the backside. If the play is flowing to the strong side and then cuts back, you need those backside linebackers need to have some of that speed, which is why it makes a lot of sense for Roquan Smith, also makes a lot of sense for Nicholas Morrow. Middle linebacker tends to have to be more of the quarterback of the defense, right? The play caller, get the signals in, make some adjustments up front, and still needs speed, right? I mean, it's not like it's a drastically different position, but it's going to be a little bit more physical than the will linebacker, and it's also going to be a little bit more middle of the field based, right? A lot of the Mike position and in terms of coverages, the will end up having more space, and a lot of times will go a little bit more toward the sideline in different coverages underneath, whereas the middle linebacker is more exclusively going to be a middle of the field zone type defender, and sometimes asked to go even deeper middle of the field in some of those cover 2 schemes. And so it is a similar skill set, but it's a question of who do you trust more in that Mike linebacker position, who can take on the physicality a little bit more, because they both have the speed to play that weak side will linebacker. The other question there is also that they don't have the strong side Sam linebacker that would be sort of the third starter in that base defense. They did sign Joe Thomas, the former Green Bay Packers linebacker, who mostly a special teams guy, but I think in a pinch could step into that role. And I don't think you're going to see them go out and, they're not looking for a Bobby Wagner type at this point, because that third Sam linebacker just isn't going to play all that much. And really, you're not going to play all that much in your base 4-3 defense. Matt Eberflus projects that the defense will be in the nickel package with just 2 linebackers on the field, 4 defensive linemen, 85% of the time. And so, if they do sign a strong side linebacker, they want someone who can also be versatile enough to play the other 2 spots and also probably be a special teams player, because they're not going to be on the field all that much, but they'll be sort of the first backup to the other 2, and then a starter when in the 15% of the snaps when this defense is actually in its base defense. And the key here is that the nickel defense with the 2 linebackers in there it's not identical, but it's going to be pretty much the same as what the Bears did in the previous regime, right? 3-4 and 4-3 defenses pretty much do the same thing in nickel. The defensive linemen / edge rushers are all in the same spots, and the linebackers tend to be in the same spots. Of course, schematically, of course, you always move guys around. It's not like everyone lines up in exactly the same spots, but in terms of the responsibilities and the things they're going to be asked to do, it's not really going to be that much different for Roquan Smith or for any of the holdover Bears from the previous regime in those nickel packages, which again will be 85%, according to Matt Eberflus, of this Bears defense. So that's why the transition to the 4-3 thing can be a little bit overblown. You don't want to completely undercount it and simplify it too much, but I think generally it's not humongous of an ask of these guys to be able to transition. It's also why that third linebacker spot is not going to be, I don't think, a mega priority in terms of really getting one more super stud linebacker there. I think it's going to be another one of these cheap veteran 1-year prove-it type contracts to kind of just get another body in there who can, again, be a versatile backup and special teams player, and then also sort of, quote-unquote, start or at least see the field when they're in those rundowns in that 4-3 base defense. Whatever they end up doing across the defense, which we're still going to need another cornerback, another linebacker, maybe another safety, maybe a nose tackle, however the Bears address it, you can be sure we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. If you're looking for your second listen, now that we're winding down, the Locked On Podcast Network has your team every day, no matter the team. Locked On Bulls, getting ready for the playoffs and trying to figure out where they're going to be seated in there. Locked On Blackhawks, winding down in the hockey season as well. Locked On Cubs, Locked On White Sox, getting you ready for baseball. And plus, Locked On podcasts across the network. So I hope you'll keep tuning in, and I hope that no matter what your team is, you're getting your fix every single day. And most importantly, I hope that the Locked On Bears podcast makes it a little bit easier for you to bear down.